As a CEO of a technology emerging growth company, I like to say that the CEO stands for Chief Explorer of Options. And one of those options is to find a strategic investor, strategic partner to do business with and potentially to be acquired by. And many of our clients find that it's very helpful that we understand how the acquirer thinks and all the processes that the acquirer has to go through in order to complete a transaction, whether it be an investment or an acquisition. The first thing that one should think of as the CEO of the company is this is one avenue of growth, not all the avenues of growth, because the CEO needs to keep growing the company that they're running in terms of their revenues, profits, headcount, technology functionality, etc., customer base. And so in terms of the target partners, the way the target partners think is that they're looking out 1 or 2 or 3 years' time, and if they're in a large company, then they really are only going to grow inorganically, meaning do an investment or an acquisition, if it's going to get them to a new market or a faster growth market sooner than they could otherwise do with their own internal resources. To get the capital in order to execute a transaction, the vast majority of these companies, I would say probably all of them, have fairly well-defined processes to get there. They have planning processes, so there's a strategy that says, okay, we're going to go after these growth markets, these large markets, and once the strategy is set, then there's a time frame to get that done, and it could be 1 to 2 years. Usually these companies are thinking in annual cycles. Some, like Microsoft, are thinking 18 months in advance. Others may be thinking 2 years, 1 year, etc. But it's not next month or next quarter. Once they've decided they're going to grow inorganically, then they have to create a budget to go and do that. And in order to create a budget that they can get approval for, they have to evaluate the different options that they have. And any smart buyer is going to evaluate all the options. So they may be looking at very large companies, which by doing a deal, they probably that company would survive a transaction post-transaction and get integrated fairly well into the large acquirer. One of the risks they see with small companies is that after the transaction, are they going to be too big for the employees of that company to assimilate well? So there's a lot of post-transaction risk that the general manager or the sponsor of the transaction has to consider going into it. So they'll assign their people to evaluate usually 3, 4, 5 different options. They might find that option A is too expensive, option E is too small, or the maturity of the technology is not there. And of B, C, and D, they'll probably meet with those companies. They might not like the people at B, which is often a key criteria. And then they'll evaluate company C against company D. They might even purchase or do proof of concepts with actually all 5 technologies. But definitely once they get further down, they want to be confident that when they're going to get the money to do a transaction, that they are on solid ground, that the technology and the company that they're going to do a deal with is safe and secure and low risk. So then they have to put together a business case. And they want to know lots of information from the target company at that point. Often it's information the target company doesn't want to give up, but it helps them to build their business case so that they can go and get the capital required to do the transaction. They'll then build a business model that is usually a 5-year or a 3 or 5-year forecast of what they believe they can do post-transaction, post-investment, post-acquisition. The processes take a long time. These are large companies. The executives have busy schedules. They have well-defined decision timeframes, but getting all the information packaged together, reviewed and approved often takes time. Once they've got their business plan approved, then they usually have what's called approval to negotiate. That doesn't mean that the deal's approved. All it means is that their corporate development person, who now is the primary negotiator on this topic, is authorized to call the CEO or the investment banker or advisor and say, we've made a decision, we're interested in discussing a potential transaction with you. I have an approved limit with which to discuss with you, and let's engage in figuring out your valuation. There are many processes beyond that that they have to go through. So they've done some preliminary, what's called pre-term sheet diligence. They've built a business case. They've got approval to negotiate. They can now negotiate, and you'll now have a discussion around what's called a term sheet. Once that term sheet is signed, from an acquirer's perspective or an investor's perspective, they want two things to be binding for sure. One is confidentiality. They don't want anybody else knowing that they're going to do a transaction with you. And secondly, they want what they call exclusivity to be binding. That means that they'll negotiate typically sort of a 45-day period whereby they're going to invest a lot of time and effort in lawyers and accountants and their people's time in making sure they know everything possible about your company, such that when the transaction closes, there's no surprises. You put your shares in escrow, they put their money in escrow, each gets the proceeds, and then the company is now owned, or the shares are now owned by the strategic investor. And in order to make that happen, they have to create a definitive agreement. And in order to contemplate all the knowledge that's found in the diligence process, in the definitive agreement, they have to do many types of diligence. There's legal diligence on all the contracts and the founding of the company, on the shares themselves, on the intellectual property of the company. There's HR diligence on the people in that company. There is facilities diligence on your buildings, and there's software licensing diligence to make sure you're not breaking other people's licenses and that you've paid for everything you're using. There's diligence on accounting, on tax, on customers, on pretty much every aspect of the company that will then get described in the definitive agreement. So once the definitive agreement has been signed and all the different parties inside the acquirer, and there's, some acquirers have teams of 60 or 70 people, each with specific designations of signing off on the environmental viability, the export-import viability, the intellectual property viability, and so on, of the company. Then once the deal is signed, there's usually some closing conditions. But in order to sign the transaction, they then have to go and get, as an acquirer, you have to go back to the guys that gave you the preliminary approval and get the final approval. And it's only then that you have a transaction that can close, because it's only at that point that the acquirer or the investor is authorized to actually sign a definitive agreement. Most of the time, definitive agreements that are signed close. A few fall out between signing and closing. That has happened. We have seen those. It's rare, but if you manage the process appropriately and thoroughly, which an advisor like GrowthPoint will help you do, the likelihood of you actually closing a transaction goes up dramatically. So as you go through all these steps, it's very helpful for the CEO to think like the acquirer and understand what the acquirer has to go through. And that is critical to keeping your sanity and realizing or being able to tolerate the a very frustrating process, a very long process, and all the requests that you get from the investor and the acquirer.